Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Premiere. Um, we are working towards the last half of Overtime, our werewolf movie. Um, and in the last half, we've got our character encountering another obstacle once he tries to get to his car in the parking garage. And then he's driving home and he's starting to werewolf out. He's becoming, he's going through the transformation and he's, having hallucinations and things like that. And then finally, he arrives at home. He tries to lock his door, and presumably he's going to chain himself up in the basement or something like that, only to find out that his friends have all planned this whole thing all along to try to keep him at work so they could have a surprise party. But surprise for them, he's a werewolf and then he eats them. So that's what we're cutting. Now, in the second half of this project, um, there's a lot more footage than the first half. It's more active. There's more opportunity to do interesting rule breaking things that are in line with the history and aesthetics we've been learning on the other half of our class. But there's more footage to go through, and you don't have your partner anymore, unfortunately. So I want to give you some tips on how to work with Premiere, just to deal with some of the amounts of footage that you have now, especially in the driving scene, but even in the party scene. I think there's a lot to work with. So I'm going to base this workflow on something that I sort of remember intuitively working out, and thinking, oh, this is probably like a casual or hack job way of doing things. And indeed, there are other methods. There's no right way. But I was reading an article, an interview with Jennifer Lame, who was the editor on Marriage Story. And she was nominated for an Academy Award for her work on it. And she was talking about her workflow, how she picks takes. And it works like this, much like a lot of early editors. She just lays it out on a timeline. And she makes the thing that I think is cool that she does, she makes what she calls stacks and works with her director. It's Noah Baumbach. Um, and they essentially pile up clips on their timeline, and whichever ones are higher on the tracks, those are the better takes. But they leave anything potentially useful available so they can go back and see. So what's cool about this is it gives you a way of sort of assembling the scene as you're going through your rushes. So for example, I'm just going to start going through in alphabetical order and looking at my rushes, and if I decide, like, okay, this is the best moment of him doing this lock. I mean, especially with the way they shot some of this stuff, there's a ton of takes in any given clip. It's not like every clip is its own take, right? So I might pull a couple from each of these, but if I'm like, okay, this is a good one, drag it down. And if this is a good one, I that's not a good one, actually. But if this is, drag it down. And I'm just gonna pile those up, and then I'm gonna keep going. Right? Go through this one, do it. Right? This was the one I pulled for that already. Go through this one. If this is the take for me, oh, and I'm just starting to make a pile. And I can give them a little bit of separation, so that when I zoom in, I'm like, okay, these are that lock, these are that lock. And as I go through, I start to build a map of the whole scene. I've kind of done it back here already. So what you're seeing here is our character coming in and then being surprised. And here's takes of him being surprised. and I'm putting all of those together on a timeline, and I have, in some cases, take after take of the same thing just lined up. But I'll take the one that I like best, like here's the reveal of the teeth, the reveal of the teeth, the reveal of the teeth, the reveal of the teeth. Any of these could be useful, but this one felt best to me, and so I brought it up on another line. Sometimes you might do it where you're like, oh, there's multiple levels of best. Like this one is good for one reason, but this one is, good for another. And you don't have to make all your decisions now, but you can start to have a little bit of a notation for yourself just by doing this. And so, like I said, Jennifer Lame calls these stacks. And what it does for you is if you start laying this stuff out, you can kind of build your scene out in order. Because it wasn't necessarily shot in order or numbered in order, but you're like, okay, first he comes home, he locks the door. So we're going to put the locks up front. And we'll go through every take of the locks. And then he drags his change out of the hallway, and then he walks down the hallway, and then he, and I'm just going to put take after take on the timeline here, highlighting the ones that I think are maybe the best candidates, but not making every decision yet. And then you can start pulling things together and saying, with a more careful eye, saying like, okay, I'm watching this one, and out of these three, this one's trash. So this one is actually making it in. And I will pull it over here to where it belongs in the actual timeline, right? As you do that, you end up basically building your scene linearly, throughout the whole timeline, and then you're leaving your second best moments back here. It may turn out, as you start to trim these down and pull the heads and tails in and actually polish it up, maybe one of your match cuts doesn't work, and it turns out your second best take actually works better than what you thought was your first best take. Well, you've still got it over here, and it's more or less in order. Right? So you can kind of grab these things, pull them in, trade them, and then make a real unpolished assembly cut, that doesn't worry about timing, but that's just like, here's all the best takes in order. Then you can start to trim and pull things in and make it more polished, more of a rough cut, and then into a fine cut. Other things that I think I've mentioned in the past, but I just want to make sure you're aware of in terms of organizing a lot of footage. If I jump to like the driving section, which you can see, same strategy. I have kind of left over, here's my stacks, and then here's the actual scene. As I'm going through all of this footage, there's like tons of takes of all this stuff. Especially a ton of him driving in traffic, just like car scenes and all this stuff. As I go through this, I may end up wanting to color code some of it. It's one thing to space it out, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything to the glance. So you can right-click clips and change their label. And there are all these colored labels. So you could start to take note of like, okay, werewolf transformation is going to be tangerine or something. Freaking out in the car and barking at the dog that's being walked outside his window is going to be, forest green or something, right? And then at least you've got all of these little subsections kind of notated. Another tool that you may or may not be aware of is the marker that you can put on the timeline with the keystroke M. You see this little doohickey here? That's a marker. You can put a lot of these on your timeline, and you can even change the marker color or give it a name or write comments if you're really into a big project that needs a lot of organization. And you can do that by double clicking on a marker to bring this up. These are all tools that will help you organize a lot of footage, such that as you're going through it, you can start to see like, okay, I'm seeing what there is, I'm seeing what is good or bad or potentially useful, and then I'm visually organizing it on my timeline. You can do it with commented color-coded markers, you can do it with color-coded sections, and you can even, as Jennifer Lame of Marriage Story does, make these visual stacks so that you can kind of get a sense of like just scrubbing over this, like, okay, I know this was, at some point I decided this was the best take of him doing this, and at some point I decided this was the best hands take. And so if I come back to this 2 days from now when I've forgotten what I was doing, I see what I was doing, and then I can start to pull all that into my actual timeline, and create an assembly edit that I can then polish, right? Because I don't have to worry about how perfect I make my in and out points when I'm just pulling this stuff into the timeline. But over here, once it's assembled, then I can bring it down. The last thing that you've got to know about once you start using your timeline in this way is you can't just go File, Export Media, and export all this, because what this would export if you just had the entire sequence, which is usually the default, it would export like 10 minutes of gobbledygook, with blank spaces and a million takes, because it doesn't know that you're using the timeline this way. So you have to remember to set in and out points with I and O on your material, and then export the sequence in and out instead of the entire sequence if you go to deal with this. So that's just an important factor if you're going to use this kind of a workflow. That said, I've broken this whole thing up into subsequences, which is another whole way of thinking about organization, because this isn't the whole second half of the film. This is just the driving section of the second half of the film. So you can treat sequences as subsequences or nested sequences. You can put sequences inside other sequences. So I could select this whole thing. This is just my edited portion, and all this is the junk that made it up, the leavings, the leftovers. If I select all this, I can right-click it and either make it a subsequence, which is going to create a sequence here, or if for some reason I wanted this sequence inside, how do I put this? This pile of clips inside this whole sequence, I can right click and do what's called a nested sequence, which is going to make all of that into just one big sequence, and replace it. And then if I open that nested sequence, here it all is. So these are tools that you can use to try to like build your structure and then pull it into another sequence over here in your project to keep yourself organized. That way your really trashed up sequence over here isn't the final product. It's the working stage, and then you can pull this finished thing into another sequence that looks more polished and has less opportunity for mistakes. So that's really why earlier in the class we were harping on the idea of, keep your stuff organized, name it in a way that is useful to you, have sequences clearly marked, give them a bin if necessary. That kind of workflow can be helpful if you start using some of your sequences as a place to throw takes and then assemble and then bring that more polished thing somewhere else to clean it up.